ahead and introduce myself and then mute myself so Stephanie can take over. I'm Misty. I've lived in Shakopee since 2016. I have 7 kids with my wonderful husband, Tim. It's just a crazy, wild ride here. Just why I joined the SDA. Just as a person of color, I felt called to start speaking out and speaking up after the murder of George Floyd. I got connected with the SDA through the Shakopee Police Department. I love being part of this group. I love the people on this group. I love just the diversity we share as a group and committee, and just learning about new people and how to reach underserved communities. SDA itself, the organization, provides personal support to families of color in our area. We've been focused on resources for people of color and who have been targeted by hate crimes, but also other issues in the community that people of color face. And we've really focused on just support, especially with COVID, because it's really hit a lot of underserved families very hard. This work is important, and why this event is important. It really highlights issues facing the Black community, especially in Black History Month. It helps to build a better understanding for our community and for us as a group, and how we can support people of color, especially in a month where we recognize people of color. I just want to say thank you to people who've donated, like St. Francis, Old National Bank. Without them, we really couldn't do a lot of the events that we do. Just keep in mind that we are donation based. So if people feel called to give, please feel free to give. That's super helpful to us, and it helps us continue to support, host events, and connect communities of color together. I'm going to introduce the speaker, and she can take it away. Thank you so much. Stephanie is here. I'll let you share whatever it is you want to share about yourself. And again, thanks, Stephanie. Stephanie, we can't hear you. Thank you, though.
Yeah, sorry about that. So before I introduce myself, I also want to thank you guys thank everybody for attending, and to thank you guys for putting on this series and allowing me the opportunity to talk about issues that are near and dear to me. I'm excited to share my thoughts and experiences with you. And even though this is a serious topic, I hope that the attendees are excited also. So a little bit about myself. My name is Stephanie Kay. I currently reside in the southeast area of Minnesota. I am a wife and mother of 5. I have a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois in English with an emphasis on culture, media, and rhetorical studies. And that also includes extensive courses in African American studies and psychology. Currently, I am a Christian author and a certified life and relationship coach. And tonight I will be drawing from my knowledge and skills, as well as my experiences as a Black woman, to offer a deeper look into the connection between racism and the rise of single parent homes in the Black community. So let me get my slides here up so everybody can see them.
And we do have one person that has her hand raised right away. Do we want to wait, or do we want to have her ask right away? Stephanie, I'm leaving it up to you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I guess since I haven't started, yes, you can go ahead.
All right. So Susan, I'm going to allow you to talk here momentarily. Susan, go ahead. You should be able to unmute yourself. So Susan, you're able to ask your question live.
Hello? I don't hear anybody.
All right, let's just keep going then.
Yeah. Okay, so before I begin, well, first I want to let people know, in case some people might have missed it or come in late, that all the questions will be answered at the end. We will have a short Q&A session, and you can post those questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, or send them to the email that was provided when you registered. And but before I get into the actual presentation, I do want to emphasize 2 things. And the first thing is that this is not nearly enough time to cover this subject in its entirety. So please do not think that what you're getting here is a comprehensive analysis, but instead it's a very brief overview. If you would like to learn more about this topic, there will be a list of links that you will get by email for all of the people that were registered for the event. The second thing I want to emphasize, and what I would really like for people to take away from this, from everything that I will talk about tonight, is this idea that everything is connected. And I say this because the Black community as like a hopeless anomaly that is somehow pre-programmed to live in poverty, participate in crime, or gravitate towards the edges of society. But the truth is that just as American history and even world history directly contributes to where we are today, especially in terms of evolution, the condition of the Black community is a byproduct of these same factors. The reality is that everything we say and do is learned, and therefore a byproduct of the wiring in our brains. And this wiring is usually established in childhood and then re-emphasized throughout the rest of our lives, and then exhibited through our behavior and choices. It is not some inherent thing in our genes that solidifies our journey in life, but is instead primarily shaped by our environment. And our environment is shaped by history. So anytime we have large groups of people who seem to be making the same kinds of choices, regardless of their race, age, sex, the environmental factors and the sources of these factors can usually provide a clear explanation, even if the individual or groups themselves are unaware of it. So understanding these factors not only reveal the complex makeup of the human mind, but it also unlocks a path to changing and reshaping our minds. Because through changing our minds, we change our behavior patterns, and then we can learn, and the same way we learn things, we can also unlearn them. So the truth is that there are so many linking factors that come together to shape our reality, experience of life, the condition we find ourselves in, and even our country in, that to dismiss Black struggles as an inherent flaw of simply being Black is a very uninformed, uneducated, and easy answer to not only a very complicated question, but a very complicated existence as human beings. But nevertheless, the key to unweaving and understanding such things is through the simple idea that everything is connected, and that the source and impact of these connections all boils down to its effects on the human mind. So with this in mind, you can consider democracy, which is the hallmark of American civilization, but it came to be from Greek philosophy that took place centuries ago. And even the calendar, how we tell time, our technological advances, and the numerous cultural practices that we participate in, most times without thinking too much about it, can all be traced back to the past and how those things affected and shaped people's minds. So in the same way, the past shapes our world and minds and the condition we find ourselves in today, what we do or don't do with our time on this earth contains the power to shape the lives and realities of those in the future, which I would go into more towards the end. So, but the point is that not understanding the connection between our history and how it affects our minds and shapes our present, it really robs us of the ability to learn from our mistakes, evolve, and see life from a wider and deeper perspective, and leave this world a better place than how we found it. And so with all this in mind, this idea that everything is connected, I want to put this in context for our shared history of slavery. And so the effects of this widely accepted cultural practice of kidnapping and selling Africans and their descendants as property for almost 300 years still reaches and stretches to our present and shapes the reality of many today, Black and white alike. Although this practice may have ended approximately 150 years ago, the belief and the ideologies of white supremacy that it gave birth to has continued, as history also shows us that ideas are harder to kill than policies, culture, and people. Those who believe that racism no longer exists or is simply not a problem don't have a thorough understanding of how history and culture shapes human psychology, and how a practice that lasted for 300 years cannot be logically or reasonably undone in 150 years since slavery, not to mention 50 to 60 years since the civil rights movement. And one of the major ways that slavery still echoes through to our time today is through the continued creation of laws and policies that either target Blacks, exclude Blacks, and place Blacks at an overall disadvantage in comparison to whites. While these disadvantages have had many negative effects on Blacks individually and as a whole, I will touch briefly on 2 ways that it has contributed to the rise of single parent homes in the Black community. So I'm not sure who has heard of this or who hasn't, but in 1965, there was a report written by sociologist, Harvard law professor, and politician Daniel Patrick Moynihan, known as the Moynihan Report, that highlighted the growing number of single parent homes in the Black community. He also noted that if nothing was done to combat this, that Blacks would not only fall significantly behind in terms of progress compared to other races, but struggle to progress in ways that would lead to economic and political equality. At the time that this report was written, Black single parent homes were at a shocking number of 25%, which was shocking because white single parent homes were only 3.1%. However, in 1991, so if 25% was shocking, what about in 1991 when that rose to 68%? And then in 2011, it was 72%. And then as of 2019, 70%. White single parent homes from 2018 to 2015 have remained steady at 30%. And as of 2019, it's just 38%. So almost half of what you have in the Black communities. Now, taking from this idea that everything is connected and environmental factors are first indicators to look at when it comes to such trends, the question to ask is why. So Moynihan attempted to answer this question of why, and he noted that the lack of skilled jobs available for Black men were a major part of the problem. This leads to my first connection, or my first point that the poverty that Moynihan points out was directly caused by systemic racism. The disheartening reality is that since Africans were first brought here on slave ships, they and their descendants have been systematically prevented from creating and accumulating wealth, and I will briefly explain how. So next, okay. It doesn't take a rocket science to understand that during 300 years of slavery, Blacks were denied the right to establish and create wealth for themselves and their descendants. Their blood, sweat, and tears did not go into securing better lives for themselves, their families, or communities, but instead to elevate the economic standing of plantation owners and their communities. So while the economy of America was booming because of the free labor of Blacks themselves could not improve their standing or quality of life, no matter how hard or how long they worked. Many might say, but that was 300 years ago, right? And this is true, but even after slavery ended, Blacks were not only never given the promised 40 acres and a mule to at least partially reimburse them for 300 years of labor with no wage and set them on a path to financial independence, but their efforts to even attempt to make a better life for themselves and their families was repeatedly destroyed and sabotaged by their white counterparts. So one way that they were sabotaged was that directly after slavery, many Blacks only had farming skills and no land of their own. And so they were forced to settle on sharecropping, which was oftentimes on the same land that they were previously slaves on. This left them at the mercy of plantation owners who had previously owned and brutalized them, which resulted in huge debts, extreme poverty, and no ability to accumulate resources of their own. During Reconstruction, white Southerners also conspired and were eventually successful in removing Blacks from political office and reducing or eliminating their right to vote, which led to the creation of laws and policies that favored whites and limited the economic growth of Blacks. After Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws were created in the South, which were primarily rooted in segregation and aimed at denying Blacks access to schools, jobs, neighborhoods, and the lifestyle that many whites enjoy due to the long-lasting economic benefits of 300 years of free labor. Jim Crow or segregation laws were founded on this idea of separate but equal. But as you can see in this photograph, the white fountain and the color fountain, that the white fountain is of a higher quality than the colored fountain. And this is just an example to show how Blacks were forced and designated to live in impoverished conditions. So the end of Reconstruction was also followed by the recreation of the Ku Klux Klan and waves of violent attacks against Black that served the sole purpose of keeping Blacks designated to this second-class citizenship role. One of these attacks took place in Louisiana in 1873, named the Colfax Massacre, where 3 whites and 150 Blacks were killed over a contested election for governor. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, on May 31st, 1921, a bustling community known as Black Wall Street, where some of the wealthiest Blacks lived at the time, was burned to the ground, and between 75 to 300 Blacks were killed by a mob of whites over an accusation of assault. This next slide that I want to show you, it has some graphic images in it. So if you don't want to see it, you might want to turn away just for a moment, but I won't stay on that slide very long. But I want to show the slide to show that, you know, I talked about this attack in Louisiana and the one in Oklahoma, but I want to show that these attacks were not unique. They took place throughout the South. And there are many documented stories of Blacks being intimidated, beaten, lynched, murdered, churches being bombed, and even children killed anytime Blacks even appeared or attempted to attain the American dream for themselves or step outside of the lower roles that whites had set for them. As a result, many Blacks fled north in what is known as the Great Migration. But even in the North, they struggled to find decent paying jobs because whites were overwhelmingly chosen for the better positions and were paid higher wages. This left many Blacks the pick of menial, unskilled jobs, of which there were few. And because these menial jobs, they were the first to be laid off when problems arose, which meant they rarely had any kind of job security. Black unemployment rose and fell with economic conditions, the same economic conditions that whites experienced, but they were usually at much higher rates. So during the Great Depression, for example, white employment was 25%, while for Blacks it was 50%, and in some places as high as 70%. Even today, Black unemployment rates have persistently remained almost twice of that of whites and no less than 1/2 since employment data began being collected in 1972. So due to poverty and systemic racist laws and practices, Blacks were also restricted from attaining a quality education, valuable training and skills, getting loans, and owning homes, especially in certain areas, which is known as redlining. All of this and more made Blacks' ability to accumulate and pass down wealth nearly impossible. The economic conditions for the average Black home and family was not only impoverished, but due to few opportunities for advancement, they had little means of even escaping it. Many times it is glossed over when Martin Luther King spoke about his dream of equality. An essential part of that dream was for Blacks to have more opportunities to improve their quality of life, which was not possible without better paying jobs. And so if you look at this slide that I have here, during the protest, you see Martin Luther King here in the front. These signs in the back are about they are about jobs. And so jobs is a very big part of the whole push for civil rights. Now you might be, thinking, okay, what does all this have to do with single parent homes? Well, for anyone who is in a family or manages a family, which is all of us, you know that success and health of a family requires resources. Throughout history, a man's ability to marry has always revolved around his ability to provide. So it is not much of a leap to consider that if a man is unable to secure decent wages, it would not only make him less likely to get married, but add to the pressure of being married if he did, and this would increase his chances of divorce. Even today, financial troubles are one of the leading causes of divorce. So how much more in a society where the ability to significantly improve your finances and quality of life was slim to none. This is also reflected in Blacks having a higher divorce rate, and many studies have shown that poor people marry less and divorce more. All of this added not only to single parent homes, but with the introduction of the welfare state in 1935, many poor families were encouraged to separate in order to receive help from the government, because one of the primary stipulations for receiving that help was that there could not be an able-bodied man living in the home. So to add to the decreases in marriage and increases in divorce, now abandonment was added to the mix, which would appear to be a viable option for desperate and struggling people. In this next slide, you can see it starts in 1963 and goes up to 2015, the chart, and it's about the average US family wealth by race from 1963 on up. And as you can see with the purple line at the top, which is a representation of whites, their wealth constantly increased. And at the bottom, Blacks' wealth pretty much, it has some increases a little bit, but it has pretty much stayed the same. So even today, Blacks in particular still struggle to find jobs, get a quality education, and maintain job security, which is directly connected to these racist laws and practices of the past, and reveal that in many ways of how racism and slavery has echoed to the future, which is now our present. It's easy to, look at the America we live in today and think that the problem is just lazy and unmotivated Black people. But to disconnect these trends with those of the past and history, as well as its effect on Black minds and even white minds that continue to show a lack of concern and compassion when it comes to Blacks, and assert white superiority in their resistance and sometimes refusal to change these practices, is to tell a man in a wheelchair to walk without recognizing he doesn't have the use of his legs. Nevertheless, societal induced poverty is but one way racism has contributed to the rise of single parent homes in the Black community. Another way is through mass incarceration. So right now I want to get a drink of water because I've been talking for a few minutes now, and you guys can use this opportunity to send any questions that you have in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, or the email that you were sent to be answered towards the end. But I want you to kind of get your questions in now, because I'm going to switch gears and go into mass incarceration. And I don't want you guys to forget about what you wanted to say, because, sometimes I have to write stuff down so I don't forget what I want to say. So while I get a drink of water, you guys can send your questions, and then I'll move on to mass incarceration.
So again, there's a Q&A button at the bottom, or you can raise your hand. And while we're waiting, I'll let the panelists make any comments if they have any.
Okay.
And Misty, we do have one question in.
You're muted, Misty.
Sorry. How can we as Black people rise? Excellent question. Yeah. Especially for the Black man or Black woman, how can we rise?
Okay, I'm gonna something that I want to say at the end will probably answer that question. So I will answer that question towards the end, which I'm almost there anyway. And so, but before we go into mass incarceration, I want to do a quick recap of the first portion, which is basically, and like I said, I would like for you guys to take away from this that everything is connected. So I want to kind of show some of the connections between these things that have happened. And so basically the benefits of free labor created the demand for slavery. Slavery created racism, And then racism created bias and unjust laws and practices. And then this led to poverty for Blacks. And this contributed or aided the growth of single parent homes in the Black community. And so, like I said, another way that has played into or aided the growth of single parent homes in the Black community is mass incarceration. But in understanding the connection to mass incarceration and single parent homes, we have to go back to 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and slavery became illegal. I mentioned that after the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of Blacks, newly free Blacks, had to resort to sharecropping, but sharecropping became one of the methods that slave owners used to legally return Blacks to a kind of slave status. So because through sharecropping, Blacks remained at the mercy of plantation owners and oftentimes had to work for them just to pay off the debt accumulated from working in the fields with none of their own tools, seeds, or equipment. However, another method used to legally return Blacks to a slave status was to incarcerate them, as the 13th Amendment granted freedom to everyone except criminals. And so using this as a loophole after the Civil War, Black codes, which were later expanded into Jim Crow laws, were used to arrest Blacks for minor offenses such as vagrancy and loitering, then put them to work on behalf of the prisons in what is infamously known as chain gangs. I want to take a note to take note here that the things that they were arrested for, the most popular things, which was vagrancy and loitering, was a byproduct of not being able to find jobs. So if you can't find jobs and you don't really have a lot to do with your time, vagrancy and loitering kind of is a byproduct of that. So, but the thing is that with slavery, slave owners had an invested interest in maintaining slaves to some extent. But with chain gangs, many Blacks were literally worked to death. During this time, the Black prison population began to grow as Blacks were arrested for minor and non-existent offenses and typically given longer sentences than whites. It was during this period that being Black began to be criminalized, which grew into a belief that Blacks were naturally violent and reinforced that Blacks were naturally violent, and then movies, music, news, and etc. reinforced and painted them as such. This belief began to be so widespread that it became the fuel for this fictitious pathology of Black on Black crime, and the primary reason why Blacks are targeted, especially by law enforcement today. These images and beliefs were so convincing that even Blacks began believing them about themselves and each other, when there is no evidence whatsoever that being Black follows a predisposition to crime. However, one's environment and exposure to prolonged poverty and oppression are crucial and major factors. Although the Black prison population grew, it remained steady throughout the Jim Crow era until 1970s, when it began to explode. And it is no coincidence that it was shortly after the successes of the civil rights movement. And so the second wave of arrests, which, you know, the first one was during the Jim Crow era. So the second wave of arrests, what began during Nixon's presidency and was said to be for the purposes of maintaining law and order due to rising crime rates. But it's no surprise and coincidence that there were other groups interested in maintaining law and order also. Blacks were often targeted and blamed for the rising crime rates, even though the growing nationwide drug use and increased population due to baby boomers were also a factor. Although consigning a large group of people to poverty with little means of advancement tends to affect crime rates also. So in just 10 short years, the prison population jumped to the highest it had ever been in America's history, from approximately 358,000 to 514,000. Although many races were in that mix, Blacks were a significant large portion, disproportionate to the population in the US. Keep in mind that they had already had larger prison population and were arrested more and given longer sentences to begin with. So if you look at the slide that I have here, it starts in 1978, but Black prison population was already way above any other nationality, and it just continued to rise significantly more than any other nationality. And this chart goes up into 2014. And so the next wave of arrests happened during Reagan and Clinton's presidency in the 80s and 90s up until 2000s, and was said to be due to the war on drugs. But Black communities and the cheaper drugs that Blacks could afford were more severely policed and penalized than whites and the drugs that flowed in their communities. So if you again look at the slide here, not sure who's familiar with these drugs and who is not, but if you look at the chart on the lighter chart, because I'm not sure what side of the screen is going to show on for you, you have crack versus cocaine. So crack is a cheaper drug, which is more accessible to poor people, and then cocaine is a more expensive drug. But you could get 5 years for 28 grams of crack, but you would have to have 500 grams of cocaine to get 5 years. And if you notice here at the bottom, where they have the prison population data from 2019, there were 79% of Black men in jail for crack, but only 17% of Black men in jail for cocaine. And on the average, they received 115 months per prison sentence, compared to whites who only got 87 months, and only 17% of whites were, 28% of whites were in jail for cocaine. And so the numbers kind of speak for themselves. And then they did have a Fair Sentencing Act, because the disparity between the sentencing was 100 to 1. But in 2010, the federal ratio was to reduce 18 to 1. So it's better, but it's not fair. It's still not where it should be, which is equal. And so for those of you who might need a little bit more of an example, if you look at the chart on the Black chart, you will see that the equivalent for crack cocaine, the teaspoons, to get the amount of time that you would get for those teaspoons, you would have to have a significant larger amounts in cocaine for the same sentencing. But aside from these grievous differences in sentencing, it was later revealed that the government was directly and indirectly involved in drugs entering the Black community due to issues surrounding their relationship with Nicaragua, which you can learn more about in a documentary called Netflix called Crack, Cocaine, and Corruption. Let me go back. The documentary is called Crack, and the subtitle is Cocaine, Corruption, and Conspiracy. And that is became recently available on Netflix. Furthermore, similar to the way that crime follows poverty, as people remain oppressed and become desperate, it also increases the appeal or getaway of drug use. Not to mention that selling drugs is easily appealing to those who struggle to find employment, job security, or little room for advancement, especially those with families. I can tell you firsthand from growing up in inner city Chicago that drug dealers were the flashiest and wealthiest people in the neighborhood. And I could see the appeal for young boys growing up to be drawn to that when they see men who have jobs they go to work to every day, but can barely change the quality of their lives. And then they compare that to these guys who have the best cars, the best houses, all the girls, the clothes, and everything in the neighborhood. So that, kind of reinforces the cycle, which I will get to in a moment. So, but with all these factors at play, the prison population exploded. People in jail for drug offenses in 1980 were only 50,000, but by the end of 1997, it was over 400,000. And Blacks were a disproportionate large part of that explosion. Instead of thoroughly addressing the history of racism and its connection to systemic poverty in the Black community and the health crisis of drug use, they just threw Blacks in jail, users and dealers alike, oftentimes with longer sentences. So to date, America has the largest prison population in the world, even though we only make up 5% of the population, and 1 out of every 3 Black men will likely end up in prison before the end of their lifetime, compared to white men, which is 1 out of every 17. And Blacks are also prosecuted and sentenced more than any other race, which you can see the statistics here on the chart, this slide that's up. And even when you get past all of this, you still have people who, once they get out of jail, what are they going to do to now contribute to their communities and families? And the next problem is that formerly incarcerated people have a harder time finding jobs than whites did during the Great Depression. As a result of mass incarceration, which unfairly targeted and penalized Blacks, many Black men and some Black women were ripped from their families and neighborhoods and given long sentences, not to mention the wide-scale drug-induced poverty that destroyed families as well. Not only did this add to the creation of single-parent homes, but it aided it into becoming a self-perpetuating culture that began producing absent fathers even when men were not in jail. And I'm going to wrap this up here in a moment. So just because the reason why this happens, why it became like a self-perpetuating culture, is because just as children who grow up in poverty are more likely to remain in poverty as adults, it's because the way their minds have been wired. So children who grow up without fathers are more likely to make choices that lead to absent fathers and mothers in their own households. It is also the same way that these ideas of white superiority still exist in the minds of many whites today, because they were taught this by their family, friends, and society. This shows that individually, impacts of the mind have smaller and more manageable outcomes. But if enough people believe something for a long enough time, that belief takes on a life of its own, therefore becoming a culture, which is what has happened when it comes to single parent homes in the Black community. Once again, it just shows that everything is connected and everything boils down to how our history shapes our environment and how our environment shapes our mind and ultimately our choices. So as Moynihan report pointed out, the lack of political and economic equality have not only been the results, but that and more. Children who grow up in single parent homes are more likely to grow up in poverty, live in poverty as adults, 2 times as likely to drop out of school, 2.5 times more likely to become a teen parent, experience divorce as an adult, have lower college and professional aspirations. They show a 17% increase to engage in juvenile crime, 11 times more likely to exhibit violent behavior. As a matter of fact, 72% of teen murders and 60% of rape crimes are done by teens from single parent homes. Struggles with depression and they will also struggle with depression, have behavioral problems, and engage in drug and alcohol use, and that is that and more. And so the risk factors are so numerous that with 70% of Black children being exposed to this, it is a huge problem that definitely needs some intervention. There have been many solutions offered, but in respect to time, I will only name a few. But they basically revolve around undoing the very mistakes that started this domino effect of problems to begin with, and to help us push dominoes in a different direction. So the first thing we have to do is learn our history. As I have said before, understanding the past is the key to changing the future, because as much as our minds are vulnerable to the influences of our environment, it also contains the ability to change them. I mentioned before that anything learned can be unlearned, but first it requires acknowledgement and re-education. Unfortunately, so much of America's history has been hidden and whitewashed that it has disconnected us from the root causes of what is going on today, which prohibits acknowledgement and re-education. Instead, we simply keep repeating and prolonging these errors instead of actually learning from them. And so I'm sorry, I kind of lost my place here. Okay, I have it. And so, okay, here it is. Okay, so I was talking about learning our history, and so saying that America's history has been whitewashed, so a lot of people don't connect the stuff that's going on today with the past. And so another example of that is if Blacks knew their history well and what we were up against in terms of jobs, trauma, family structure, the grim prospects for children brought up in single parent homes, and the work that was done to get us to the progress that we have today, we could start ahead of the race instead of behind it, or not become so wrapped up in it that we can't see past it. If whites were made more aware of the errors of their ancestors, they would not only too often live in oblivion to what life is like for those who are not white, but they will understand that although their lives are not easy, they do live in a place of privilege that was gained on the backs of slaves. Knowing this offers the choice to embark upon a new path to dismantle the wrongs of their ancestors instead of unknowingly perpetuating it. The second to last thing is to speak up against injustice and to help make the cry for change louder and the push for change harder. As I stated earlier, those before us shaped the world we live in today, which means we also have the power to shape the world of the future and the world our children live in for tomorrow. But to do so, we have to change our thinking, which will change our choices, which, even though it's gradual, it will eventually change our culture and environment. But changing things has never and will never be easy, and requires us to press forward in the face of resistance and difficulty, because just as rewiring the brain itself is not easy, doing what you were taught comes naturally. So it becomes more of a, it becomes harder to now change and do something differently. But it requires work, is basically what I'm saying. And that work begins with a very small step of raising and using our voices in whatever capacity or situation requires it. With enough people or enough minds speaking for the same thing, a ripple turns into a wave, and thus begins the push in a new direction. And this is the last thing. The third thing is helping to create laws, policies, and programs that combat these issues at the source. So creating programs in the Black communities that seek to fill the gap for those in single parent homes, creating programs in the Black community that seek to fill the gap for single parent homes, as well as provide mental health services. I lost my place again. Oh, it's right here. Okay. Provide mental health services, as well as educate and advocate education to combat poverty, along with teaching valuable skills, training, pushing for prison reform, and a plethora of other racially biased practices are just the tip of the iceberg. We need to do these things with the understanding that what happens to the least of us inevitably affects the rest of us, because an essential part of all the connections that I was talking about, or I have been talking about all this time, an essential part of those connections is that we are also connected to each other. And so that is the end of my presentation. Now we're going to open it up for questions, and Misty, I'm waiting for you.
Okay. I just want to tell you, thank you. That was amazing. Excellent, excellent. Actually, the first person I said, excellent forum. What do you feel is the best way for us to go as Black people moving forward? So what can we do? We can educate, what can we do?
I mean, the thing about that is that a lot of times so racism, slavery lasted for 300 years. And I kind of mentioned this in the beginning, and it's only been like 150 years since it's been eradicated, made illegal, but we still have obstacles related to that to overcome. So whatever we do now, we have to understand that it's not going to be quick. Like 300, something that lasted for 300 years, and then we're still feeling the effects of it 150 years later, shows that the work is going to be it's going to be gradual, and it's going to be small, but it has to be consistent. And so as Black people, I would, as a Black person myself, I would say the very, very first thing we have to do is educate ourselves. A lot of Blacks don't have a lot of this knowledge about our history. Like, we know who Martin Luther King is, we know who Malcolm X is, we know who Harriet Tubman is, but we don't really understand the things on a bigger scale about what happened and how it has affected us as a people. And so when we don't have this lack of, when we have this lack of education, it makes us not respond to the problems that's in front of us in the right way. And so we really need to educate ourselves about and educate our children, because I was even talking, you know, especially since the death of George Floyd, a lot of conversations started to come up that I'm sure in other people's homes also. And one thing that I recall as a kid is my parents never talked to me about racism. They never talked to me about slavery. They never talked to me about racism. It was just something that I learned from school. But just look at how white racist, I don't like to say white because I know all white people are not racist, but this white superiority has been passed down because it has been taught. And so even 150 years is still a force to have to deal with. Now, just imagine if Blacks were passing on this knowledge to their children about our ancestors and what we have to do and what we have to fight and the obstacles that we have to come, we will be an even stronger force to deal with than we are now. And so I would say the first thing is very, very important. And they say knowledge is power, and it's very, very true, is that we have to educate ourselves and we have to educate our children. And then any change that comes will come out of that education, because most of the time when you know better, you do better. And so that is just, you know, a natural consequence of that. And so sorry for the long answer, but that's my answer.
Stephanie, I also wanted to have you touch on just a little bit about talking to your kids, because you talk like education is one of your main points in this first question, being responsible as a Black parent and talking to your kids about racism, talking about what happens to Black people, continuing that conversation even after George Floyd is gone, and continue it down the road so the Black children know this is the past and here's how we change the future.
Yeah, it's a difficult conversation. As I mentioned in the beginning, I have 5 kids myself, and I was always very leery of telling them about racism because I didn't want to take their innocence away from them so fast. It's like kids are carefree. They, you know, they don't understand how bad the world is. And so when you introduce this idea to them that there are people in the world who don't like them for no reason other than the color of their skin or assume the worst of them, it does become a difficult conversation. And as much as I wish that my parents would have talked to me about it, I understand why they did it, because it's a difficult thing to try to translate to a kid. And so, but one of the things that you can do, even if you don't come right out and say, there are people who don't like you because you're Black, you start to build up their identity. You start to educate them. You start to help them to see the value in themselves, so that when the time comes for them to learn about the outside world, it doesn't affect how they see themselves. And so I talk about, you know, in my my presentation, it all comes down to the mind. And so you don't want to have a negative impact on the child's mind while they're growing, before they get a firm grasp on who they are, before you start introducing all these other things to them that tell them otherwise about themselves. But so you can do things, it could be directly, like when they get to a certain age, especially when they start asking, then that's usually a sign that they're ready for the conversation. But you can do things in the meantime, like just reasserting their value and their worth as, you know, Black kids and things like that, until the time comes for you to have that conversation with them, and also teaching them how to treat people, because that's a part of it also.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I'm going to say people's names, or try to say people's names with their questions. So if I get your name wrong, I apologize. That is not my intention. I believe it's Tanya. Tanya just wanted to say thank you, Stephanie, for all this information. How can we as white people, this is a long question, so give me a minute, break down the redlining issue as an example for how corporate America has worked to keep Black fellow citizens down? And there's going to be another part to that question. So I'll let you go with that one first.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I don't have like knowledge about the financial sector to that degree, but it's the same, like, it's like we have a responsibility individually, and then we have responsibility collectively. Really, there's not a lot of things. I mean, your progress will be minimal if it's just you. So, but the first thing you do is what you can do. So if you work at a bank and there's some laws or policies or things you want to bring to highlight or question, which is going to be uncomfortable for you. But if you want to start there, especially depending on wherever you work, even if it's not necessarily in a bank when it comes to the redlining thing, you can start there. So if you work, say, in a grocery store and you notice that Black people are treated differently, then it's your responsibility then to say something. So, but beyond the individual responsibility, then you have a collective responsibility to kind of try to connect with like-minded people like you, and you guys kind of join together to push a change. So say, for example, you're working in a bank, and it's just you kind of pointing out here and there and stuff you're noticing. A lot of change might not come from that. But now if there are 5 people that work there, or there are 10 people that work there, or 15 people, then it becomes something you can't ignore anymore. And so that would be the same, you know, I don't know the specifics about redlining per se, but that would be the same for, you know, any way that you want to enact change is to do what you can individually and then find like-minded people like you and organize with them to be a bigger force to push towards that change.
Okay, next part of the question, still same person, Tanya. She says, I think this issue is one that can speak to white middle America today. I would prefer to speak to deeper issues myself, but I feel this is kind of whitewashed. First world problems that those who are not used to facing their white privilege can take as that first baby step towards finding a new perspective. Like she's asking, what are your thoughts on that? And she said, thank you again. This is a great discussion. So what are your thoughts on the whitewashing problem and like gently walking towards white privilege without causing resistance?
You kind of, and thank you again, Tanya. I know Tanya, she's one of my dearest friends.
Thanks, Tanya.
Yeah. I think if it's the same Tanya anyway, it sounds like her from what the question that you're asking. I know there might be other people named Tanya, but the thing is that you really can't avoid the friction. And I think that's where a lot of problems come in, especially, you know, you've heard from whites over the years when they were saying to Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, just wait, just wait. Like you, and if you just wait, nothing's gonna happen. So you have to force that change. So if you're expecting or trying to avoid making people uncomfortable or whatever, it's not going to work. People have to be made uncomfortable because that is where change comes from. And so, but as far as like, I mean, it's just baby steps. Like, you know, again, if you want to start with yourself, you know, as far as re-educating, watching yourself, especially when it comes to like microaggressions and things like that, then you can branch out and maybe talk to your kids, talk to your family, your relatives, and, you know, try to find people in the neighborhood and things like that. And so it's basically you just start with yourself and work on yourself. That's always like the most important thing. And then you kind of branch out from there. But resistance is unavoidable. Hostility is unavoidable. And, you know, even people becoming angry or violent when it comes to these kinds of things is unavoidable. And we kind of have to be prepared for that if we really want to stand and push for change.
Very good, thank you. Next question, and I'm not getting the names with these, so I apologize. Let me roll back up here. Technology is not my strong suit, if everyone can tell. I believe the name is John. Yep, John. Wants to know if you can mention that much of the incarceration attributed to vagrancy during Reconstruction was due to many Black men walking the roads looking for their family members, wives and children who were sold off to distant plantations during slavery, which showed the importance of men's desire to maintain the solidity of their family.
Yes, I thank you for mentioning that. I was, you know, like I said, this is not nearly enough time to cover this topic. There are so many areas that it branches out into and so many effects. And this is not, these two things are not the only two things that have contributed to the rise of single parent homes in the Black community. So I did have to condense things a little bit so I don't go too far off of the point. But you're right, that was a part of also, you know, the vagrancy and loitering and people after slavery really looking for their family members and trying to connect with them. And I think something else that John mentioned, because the stereotype, it becomes like, well, Black people don't care about family or Black people don't care about their children, things like that. And so if that was the case, we all came from Africa. And so there is not a high divorce rate. There is, I mean, in Africa, especially my husband is from Nigeria, so I have firsthand experience of this. You rarely hear about single mothers. You rarely hear about divorce. I mean, they do have them, but the numbers are very, very low. And so if this was something that was inherent in Black people, that we just don't really value family and love each other, like with this whole idea of black on black crime, like we just kill each other, that is not true, because if that was the case, you would see black communities around the world showing the same behavior, and they do not do that. This is something that has happened in America with the black community, and there is also another community that also has these high divorce rates and single parent homes and violence and things like that, and it's Native Americans. And it's not a coincidence that Native Americans and Black people are suffering from the same type of repercussions under a system of oppression that has taken place in America since its conception.
Very good. This next question is from Candy. It says, what are some key strengths in the Black community that can be built upon to promote equity? Like, what can the Black community do to promote their own equity? I'm hoping, Candy, if I'm not getting your question right, please type that in, but that's what I'm gathering from the question.
Yeah, I mean, I would like a little more detail on that question, because I'm not sure exactly what she's asking. She's saying in terms of economics, or, oh, let me close this slide because I don't need any more.
And I can actually unmute people. So,
yeah, maybe Candy, can she unmute and maybe get a little more in depth? I'm not, she said, what are some key strengths in the Black community that can be built upon to promote equity? I don't know if she means that for herself or for whites.
Candy, you can unmute yourself. I just allowed you to. And then for anyone else, now you can start raising your hands if you want, for me to give you permission to talk.
Hi, and thank you so much. This has been a wonderful hour. I was thinking of strengths in the Black community, like in families or in community life, that we could focus our policies and program changes on.
Yeah, if I understand you right, you're not talking about relationships between Black people. You mean equity on a larger scale towards the Black community. Am I understanding you right with that?
I would say relationships in the Black community are a key strength. That would be an area we could focus on. But I'm curious what you would suggest we as a society should be focusing on in terms of strengths that you see.
Yeah, well, I would say that one of the major things, and I mean, it's unfortunate that it all sometimes comes down to money, but it's gonna take resources and an investment into the Black community. So when Black people, because poverty has been so systemic in the Black community for so long, it has created this culture that kind of revolves around poverty. But if we had, resources, I mean, even the way we relate to each other a lot of the time. And so, but if we had resources and programs that could educate us, give us skills, give us resources. And I kind of talked about it at the end of my presentation, mental health, things like that. All of those things will only enrich. Now, is it going to catch everybody and turn the whole entire thing around? Me, you're always going to have those people that fall between the cracks, but it definitely will improve things a lot if we can just invest into, I mean, I hope I'm answering your question, because I'm not sure if I understand it right, because relationships between each other is a byproduct of a larger system. So you have to kind of tackle those larger issues first, and then they would naturally trickle down, just like racism is a larger issue and it trickles down into all side things. You attack the larger thing first, and then it will naturally trickle down. So if we can make more investment into the Black community as far as pushing education, getting people out of poverty, more access to jobs, skills, training, and things like that, it would naturally trickle down into changing the way that Black people deal with each other. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, I love it. Thank you.
The next question actually came from my husband, which is mildly amusing. He must be listening downstairs. He just wanted to know, do you have any resources or website that's highlighted proposed policies or laws that either promote equity or reduce equity? Like, he wants more specific, like, laws or resources that you have that specifically target either to promote or reduce equity for Black communities.
Yeah, and so this plays into this whole thing that we are all connected, and so everybody has their own part. My part is not policy making. I'm not a really big on politics and things like that. So my voice is more so to build, to educate, and to build up, the Black community, our sense of self, our identity, things like that. So policies and things like that is not my strong suit. But you probably can research stuff like that online and find out, from other people who that is their strong suit about the type of policies that are trying to be pushed. I mean, I know that there's a lot of policies that have been attempted to be pushed through Congress and things like that, and they never get through. And so, but I don't know all of those, what they are,
Okay.
Yeah.
And I can have him do his own research. So thanks for
Yeah.
that. This question comes from Gina. She said, this is an SDA question. So Anna, we'll touch base on this later. She wanted to know if we could share where the recorded presentation can be found following the meeting. I'm assuming she would like other people to see it as well. So Gina, we will get back to you. Jolie, who's going to be our allyship speaker. Stephanie, thank you for Jolie. Jolie, thank you for being here. She said it's time to make people uncomfortable. Amen. If you're allowed to say that in a webinar, amen.
Jolie actually raised her hand, so I'm gonna unmute her.
Yes, everyone, this is Jolie. We will see her again. So please please say hello to Jolie.
Let's see, did I unmute? Oh, I am. Okay, okay. Yes, I'm really, I'm looking forward to the opportunity in March. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions of what can we do. And my response about to Stephanie is it's time to make people uncomfortable. It is. We learning the history we have here. We also, as white people, have to understand that history, connect that history. Just like Stephanie said, it's all connected. Because once we understand that, we can move forward. And I am so looking forward to using all the training and the education I've done to share with others how to take that step and check into their privilege every morning. So I'm really looking forward to that time. Thank you.
Thanks, Jolie. I believe I'm saying this name correctly. I believe it's Jason. If I'm saying your name wrong, I apologize. He said, do you feel, and this is going to be a political question. So everybody just take a deep breath. It's a political question. It's going to be all right. It says, do you feel now that Biden, no, I'm reading this wrong. Do you feel that Biden is now in office with Kamala Harris as his vice president? How do you feel that things will change? Do you feel things will change?
I think it will be, as I mentioned before, it's like baby steps. Is he a baby step in the right direction, in a better direction, I should say? Then I would say yes, because even during his inauguration, they said this was the first president to ever mention racism in his inauguration speech. And so that is a step, because like I said, it all comes down to the mind. And so when you say things like that on such a huge platform, you are awakening people's minds, even though they might need a little bit more awakening or knocks upside the head, so to speak. Those little things all help to again increase the push for change. And so I do think that with not only him having a Black a person of color as his vice president, but also being the vice president to the first Black president, I do think it points towards us moving in a different direction. Although like a lot of Black people, a lot of Black people I know are very, very skeptical. I understand that. And I'm not completely skeptical, but I'm not completely on board like he's my savior either, or he's going to make these great changes for us. I really think it still boils down to us doing the work, us pushing change, us making steps. Because in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, it seems like after a lot of the civil rights leaders were killed, especially Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, around that time, we Black people stopped pushing. And whether that was because we were discouraged because of what was happening, or we gave up, or we got more rights, so we kind of felt like, okay, it's better, so let's just work with what we have. We didn't push as much. We didn't fight as much as we needed to. And so I think we should necessarily look for a president to be the answer, but we should look for a president that will listen to us when we talk, because the work is up to us as individuals to bring it to his attention that this is something that needs to happen. So that's kind of how I see it.
Thank you. Does anybody else have questions? I think I got most. If I missed a question, please raise your hand so Anna can unmute you. I'm hoping I got most of them. Before everybody gets ready to go, I just want to tell everybody thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Anna. Thank you to my team. I can see Heidi. I can see Rich. I can see Kevin. I can see Whitley. I can see Kelly and Lamar. I'm just thanking you in front of everybody. Like, SDA has been great. My committee is amazing. Thank you so much, everybody, for your hard work.
And John has a
everything.
question.
Oh, sorry, John, go ahead.
I didn't need to unmute there. I left a question in the chat box there just to kind of answer your question for your husband.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and basically what I was saying was that he can go, anyone can go, especially to answer that question, because that was a good question there, to go to the Urban League's website, and that's the Urban League nationally or the Minneapolis Urban League. And each year they put out the State of the Black America, and it's a lot of information here on things, but they also talk about different strategies too here that you can use locally here. And a lot of the issues that they frame not only affect Black community, but also our Native American communities as well too. So you can look into a deeper aspect of being able to kind of help people here in Minnesota here. But the other thing too is to connect with the African American Leadership Forum here in Minnesota, because they're very active and they are doing a lot of different work. And you can look up some of their strategies as well as connect with them on being a part of some of the things that they're doing.
Very good. Thanks for that, John.
Yeah.
That's excellent information.
I had one comment. Outside of this, I work in the labor field. And one thing that happens is, like with temp agencies, sometimes employers will call and we'll use code language like, hey, send me the soccer players. I don't want any basketball players. And that's just, there's like visible racism in the workforce, and a lot of the industries that Black and brown folks are encouraged to go into tend to be industries that are rampant with wage theft. So just another side note. And Misty, I know we're past time, but could you just let people know some of the events we have coming up?
Yes. So Stephanie K, thank you again. I will thank everybody 100 times. For our next talk, which is coming out next week. I know, Stephanie, please promote your Facebook page before you get off so people can go there and check things out. You have tons of good resources on your Facebook page as well. For the SDA, we're doing 4 events for this month. This is the first one. So again, thank you to Stephanie. Our next one will discuss health disparities. We're going to talk about the school to prison pipeline. And lastly, we're going to address homelessness in the Black community and how that plays into racism, just to tie together issues facing the Black community in Black History Month. And Stephanie was gracious, and part of it is just including, like, what can we do? How can we work together? How can we build community? So just continue to keep those things alive, because these are still, like she said, going to be issues that happen in the future. Oh, your daughter said, Stephanie, I believe this is your daughter. She said, this is my mom and I'm really proud of her. Good job, Mom. Good job.
Thank you.
All right.
That's fantastic. If anybody else has questions, please feel free to raise your hand. I don't want anybody to think I missed them.
And otherwise, everyone should know they will be receiving a email after this. Actually, tomorrow you'll receive the thank you email, and it has like over 30 resources, a bunch of resources of materials for those of you that are thinking, well, where do I start from here? And those were carefully curated by Stephanie. So, and I think Jackie has a question. So Jackie, I just allowed you to talk.
Stephanie, don't forget to promote your webpage, your
Okay, no
Facebook
problem.
page. Jackie's still mute. We can't hear her.
Yep, so I just allowed her to unmute herself. Jackie H.
While Jackie figures out unmuting and asking her question, I'll just say the next link for registration will be up tomorrow morning. So check it out on Facebook.
Oh, Jackie is not wanting to unmute, but she said, "This is my niece and I'm proud of her too." Stephanie, we are proud of you as well. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you.
All right.
Stephanie, can you plug your Facebook page? Because there's tons of resources on your Facebook page as well. You do a lot of live events. You have a lot of movies, books, things you talk about that just continue to build that community and talk about those resources.
Yeah, so my Facebook page or my website. I guess
Just
the same
both,
thing.
do both.
Yeah. And so my Facebook page and my website is called Unveiling the Spirit. I will include it in the links for the thank you email that you'll get. But my email, my Facebook page and website revolves around like I said before, I'm a Christian life and relationship coach. So I do a lot of coaching people when it comes to kind of spiritual issues or wanting a spiritual take on their issues. And then I also have books that I've written along those lines. So I tackle a lot of kind of controversial or sensitive topics in relation to that. And that's what you can kind of find on my Facebook page and my websites. And I also have some books that I've written also along those lines. And so that is, again, I will include the links on the thank you email.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. And I think that concludes our webinar today.
No.
Right.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity, and thanks everybody for